Screen Park Unlimited.
This is episode 24 of the Ghost Stories, and both of these ghost stories are from the Isle of Wight. The first one is called Concert from Beyond the Grave. And here's the story. A dozen regimental police are not easily frightened, but one night spent in the empty officers' quarters near Golden Hill Fort was more than they could stand. By 2 a.m. they were so unnerved by their experience in the old building that they took to their heels and ran. Gerald Wildish of Tennyson Road, Cowes, remembers it well. He was stationed at the fort for his national service from 1959 to 1962. With the RASC learning seamanship and boat handling, by then the fort's days were numbered, and Gerald's regiment, the last troops to be stationed on the island, were preparing to move out. It was a bleak, grim place, he recalled. There were so few men left that 12 regimental police were brought in to do guard duties. That cold, clear night in the early spring, Gerald was standing his last night's guard duty. The reinforcements had arrived that afternoon, drawn their bedding, and were camping out in the empty officers' quarters across the road. At 11 p.m. the huge fort gates were closed. Gerald and 5 other men settled down for their watch. Just after 2 a.m. came a tremendous disturbance. There was shouting, running footsteps, and a hammering at the fort gates. All 12 regimental police, including a sergeant and 4 corporals, were outside the main gates in a state of undress, shouting to be let in. Gerald wrote the duty cook and brewed strong tea for the shaken men. They refused to go back to the officers' quarters that night and slept in the fort cells instead. They told us they had all heard classical piano music being played in the empty building. At first they thought it was someone fooling around, but the music continued. They searched the place, but there wasn't a stick of furniture there, let alone a grand piano. Finally their nerve broke and they ran, wearing whatever uniform came to hand. We discovered later that the building may have been used in 1957 as a temporary mortuary for some of the dead from the island's worst ever air disaster, said Gerald. This involved a short Solent flying boat owned by Alcala Airways, which crashed shortly after taking off from Southampton, killing 45 people. It came down in chalk pit at Stalcombe Farm, burst into flames. 2 officers from Golden Hill Fort and the senior NCO were just yards away from when the plane crashed. They led the rescue party, dragging out dead and injured, until, with their own clothing alight, they were driven back. The passengers had been flying to mortuary via Lisbon, and among the dead was a concert pianist on his way to an engagement did his spirit linger in the old deserted building until he could find an audience for his final concert from beyond the grave? Those 12 men certainly believed it did. The old officers' quarters have been converted into flats, but the ghostly pianist has given no encore. Occasionally the sound of footsteps is heard in the empty apartment, but they bother nobody. One resident wistfully wished the pianist would make a comeback. Imagine having your very own concert given by a ghost. I would love it, she sighed. And the next one is called The Hungry Ghost. Over 100 years ago, 4 soldiers died in a horrific explosion at Freshwater Redoubt, and at least one of them does not lie easy in his grave. At the nearby churchyard, his ghost has been seen walking around the old garrison, searching, it is said, for his dead comrades. Perched on the cliff edge overlooking Freshwater Bay, the fort is privately owned by Chris and Kate Smith, who bought it in the year 2000. They plan to live there themselves and have been granted planning consent for apartments and public function room at the fort. The fort, which had an upper and lower battery, barracks and parade ground, a deep dry moat and bridge, was constructed in 1856 to protect against attack by the French, but its guns, which had a range of 2 miles, never fired in anger. The garrison could accommodate more than 30 men and officers, although in peacetime much smaller members were stationed there. During the competitive artillery firing in front of senior officers in June the 25th, 1901, the breech block of the fort's right-hand 12-pounder gun blew out, killing Staff Gunnery Instructor Captain Arthur Leslie Beret, Gunner Charles Dorman, Gunner Ricketts, and Bomb Arthur MacDonald. Also injured 6 other men, including Colonel Nixon, RA, commander of the Isle of Wight forces. By 1918, the fort was disarmed. 10 years later, the War Office sold it to Amelia Borland. Cost worth £600 in 1935. It was bought by Edward Emery Greenwich, who added the top story to create a family home. A tunnel for bathing access to Freshwater Bay was dug from an ammunition store in the lower battery. During the Second World War, the fort was guarded, though not occupied by the Home Guard. In 1970, American billionaire Byron DeWitt Daugherty bought the fort, but seldom visited it, selling it on instead to developer Mr. Figgins. He built the tea rooms in 1974 and the site of the old gun emplacements, and in 1977 sold the fort to Margaret and Paddy Longmore. While they loved their unusual home, the couple was certain that ghosts still walked the old fort. For two phantom soldiers were seen standing on a bridge over the deep dry moat surrounding the rowboat. One of them was smoking a cigarette. In the entrance tunnel lurked the dark shadow of another soldier. This man was said to have been crushed to death against the wall by a horse and cart. An eerie green light would flicker around the courtyard before disappearing into the former guardroom. Some old freshwater fishermen told the Longmores they avoided the fort after dark. Margaret and Paddy were certain their ghosts had a sense of humour, and particularly the fondness for these electrical, especially video recorders, which often went haywire. Unable to sleep one night, Margaret got up at 3 a.m, made a coffee and went back to bed. As she drifted off to sleep, she glanced at her radio alarm. The digital display showed 7 a.m. So she got up, brushed and dressed, ready to start the day. A ghost was having a joke at my expense, because when I started work, I found it was still in the middle of the night. That electric clock had jumped forward 4 hours. She said. In the tea rooms, now sadly closed, a greedy ghost was heard smacking its lips across the choice of cakes. Margaret explained. Before the customers arrived one morning, my daughter and one of the waitresses were trying to decide which of the gatehawks looked at the most delicious. My daughter decided she liked the lemon cake the best. Someone sighed. With evident longing, both girls spun around, but the room was empty. Whatever was in the room with them had certainly sounded hungry. So that's the end of that ghost story. So that's the end of this episode, and it's time to say cue those credits.
Sí.
Es que estoy tan a gusto ahí en la piscina.